Well, this is the part that's going to sound like an interview and not a conversation. But Tansel Ali, thank you very much for agreeing to have a conversation today about your expert knowledge on memorization.
Yeah, no, thanks for organising this and downloading the software that we need to record this. So hopefully it comes out okay, and we should be right.
I think we'll be okay. Otherwise, people will just hear. So, thanks for joining the show. I want to just start, first of all, by whoever ends up watching this, by just plugging your book here. I picked the right book, haven't I? This is you. This is not Tony Bazan.
No, that's me.
Tansel.
Yeah, good choice.
How did you come up with the title, The Yellow Elephant?
Well, it's good. I read your book, the Choices one, and I thought, bloody brilliant. So you'll understand where I'm coming with this from a memory perspective. But usually when, people trying to remember something, if you've got a title of a book, 101 ways to do things, blah, 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 it's not really that memorable, right? You go, well, what was that title of the book's name, right? So you've got to have some sort of an image. As soon as you say yellow elephant, you'll picture an image, right, of a yellow elephant, if you can. So it's visual. So I've tried to use some of the techniques of encoding, abstract information into visual images. So that's where I came up with the yellow elephant. Took a bit of convincing for my publisher, but once I explained how memory worked, I was like, okay, good, we'll do the yellow elephant.
It's insane that you need to convince anybody of that. When I said years ago, I told a friend had lunch with him, and I told him I was writing my book, and he said, "What do you call it?" And I said, "Choices," and he goes, "Yeah. I just think there's a better one out there." And yet I've had a lot of people over the years have said to me, choices is great, especially specifically relating to actors, because they think, oh yeah, choices. We always hear about choices, but what on earth are these choices? So the yellow elephant, I love the fact that it's not a yellow elephant, it's a black elephant, but that also gets people talking about it.
Yeah, well, it's funny because the publisher, when they first sent me the design of the cover, it was a blue design where the yellow that was blue and the writing was in orange. I said, no,
you missed the point.
What are you doing? So it's so bizarre where that went to. But yeah. So the yellow hits you the most. So people still get that subconscious. Oh yeah, it's yellow elephant.
Do you know what yellow means in terms of color psychology?
Not really. Probably hunger.
Yeah, that's right. McDonald's, it makes you eat more. Makes you eat more.
Yeah, look. Initially, the reason why I call it yellow elephant. There was that whole memory technique perspective, but it was because I memorized yellow pages and elephant resembled memory. And I just thought I'll put it together, but that wasn't convincing enough for the publisher, so I had to go by the explanation of the memory technique. So luckily that fitted in. So,
but it's great, and even playing with the idea of don't think about the pink elephant in the room or whatever. As soon as you're told not to think about that, that's all you can think about, and memory and elephants don't forget and everything. And it's just it's so much better than online memory course. Which of course you try and SEO that, it's not going to stand out. But I love it anyway. I love the book. I remember the first time I experienced you at all was, I don't know whether it was in the book or maybe you said this in an interview or something I'd read, talking about tinsel on a Christmas tree as a way to recall your name, which I meet people all the time and I say, "Oh, hi, what's your name?" And they tell me, "Oh, Gitangeli," or something. And I'm like, oh, and I always employ the technique to ask what it means or how they spell it, rather than just go, "I'm stupid, I'm not going to remember it." And I remember Gitangeli, this woman years ago, she said it actually means great angel, which of course visually is wonderful, but it also makes sense. Great angel even sounds like it. So, and then other people will say their name and they'll tell you, it rhymes with this. Nairi, I met years ago. She said Nairi rhymes with diary, and I was like, oh, okay. It's not a particularly visceral image, but it's certainly stuck in my mind. How long did it take you to write your book?
About 10 days.
10 days to write a book. Ladies and gentlemen out there, that's all you need. If you want to write a book in 10 days, that's going to be your
That's it. We're done for today. Thanks for your time. No, look, 10 days, it seems bizarre, but, I gave myself the time to write it, of course. But the thing is, I knew what I wanted to write about, so writer's block didn't happen because what I did was I just put in There was going to be an introduction, there was going to be, a finish to it. There's going to be, some memory techniques. Well, what are the memory techniques? I'm going to write about this, this, this. So I just put all the headings down. And then what I did was, okay, I'll write a bit in the headings. What are the subheadings? And as soon as you start plugging away bit by bit by bit, you actually get stuff done. It's almost like making a movie, right? They don't start from start to the end. They go, we might even start from the end part. I might run through the conclusion first, or I might start writing about techniques. So you're never sort of blocked out, have writer's block with anything.
And writing about what you know is obviously a big thing, and all the screenwriting books will tell you, well, all of them, some will say not, but the majority say do all of your research up front and then write whatever you want to write. But if you start writing what you want to write and then you get writer's block, you've got to go and research anyway. Research the American Civil War, research generals and Confederate flags, and research the costumes and the weather and the terrain. Once you've got that, you just see it. You don't need to go, now what kind of a tent would they have while you're in the middle of the creative flow? So I love that. I just wanted to move to segue slightly onto, I love your article here about the 7 steps to learn anything in 48 hours. And I added up the hours you say from gathering materials and resources, up to 3 hours, develop the memorization strategy, which we'll go into shortly, up to 2 hours, prioritizing materials, and then even creating accountability up to an hour, getting other people to hold you to that. But I added them all up, and it's sort of under 50 hours of work there.
Yeah.
So, 48 hours. So does that include like learning a language, learning anything?
Yeah, look, that was just a broad guide, really, to learning anything. I mean, all you really have to do is get what you need and apply a right strategy and execute that strategy. That's all it is. So 48 hours is actually quite a conservative figure. I mean, there's books out there, how to learn within 20 hours. A very popular book. I mean, great book, in fact. So, it's just all about, where you're going to access the information. And we're in the age at the moment where we just have to Google something and it's there, right? Information's there. Now, you obviously sift it through and research and find the right one. But, we're in an age where we've got everything that we need. So the next part is, okay, how are we going to execute what we need, right? So, research can be done fairly quickly. Now what can we do? So that's the stage that we're at. And things like memory techniques and, building a proper strategy helps with execution, because what happens is that once you've got that right strategy, the execution is really easy. So that's how I memorized the phone book. Right, I just had to create this massive plan, which took me 6 days, and then I had 24 days to memorize a phone book. Now, that was the easy part because it was just the execution of the plan, but the plan was very difficult to create. So it's the same thing with learning. It's not really such a figure of, okay, can you do anything in 48 hours? Well, you can learn a language very quickly if you memorize all the phrases. So you don't have to learn the grammar and this and that and that. Yeah, it's great. It's great fun if you're doing it over a period of time. You've got no, time requirements. But if you want to learn a language fast, well, how do we learn it as kids? Our parents speak to us in the phrases, right? Hey, how you going? Don't do this, don't do that. They don't say, well, put an exclamation mark at the end of that, or where was that comma? In between that sentence. We don't hear that. So if we learn the most common phrases of any language, then we've got it. And you can easily do that within a few months if you've got a strict sort of memorization pattern. So, it's all about strategy, and the execution follows from the technique. So that's how I sort of came across that.
That's really important, and that's where I'm at. As I said to you, I've been teaching various forms of memorization techniques almost exclusively to actors for about 20 years, but I've kind of gotten as far as they need to go, really. So even if someone needed to memorize Hamlet, I get that far. But if somebody wanted to memorize the entire canon of Shakespeare's plays and sonnets, well, I would need to talk to someone like you to go, can you help me create a much larger framework and system within which to do it? So I teach people a mini version of the mind palace, the memory palace, and it works really well when I go in and I do a whole day or a weekend of acting classes, because everyone pulls out their notepads and I say, put your notepads away, you will not be using them this weekend. And everyone freaks out and I say, no, listen, if after the first hour you honestly think this doesn't work, will write everything down, but even after the first 10 minutes. So, and then regularly I take breaks and I recap and I teach them the memory palace and I get them to create their own and to put things into their own. But once they've done that, their memory palace is scattered with furniture, effectively, of all of this stuff they're memorizing. But then if all of a sudden they had to memorize all of geography, all of American presidential history, all of the human anatomy and the nervous system and the endocrine system, what I've set up is like putting everything on your desktop in a neat way, but not putting it into a structure. So were you always good at study? Because people say, oh, you must have always been good at memory. And you're like, well, I was no better than anyone. But you must have had a logic, or you must have been decent enough at studying and organizing things to start with, were you?
Yeah, look, I think it's more, I was more creative.
Right.
And I always thought the quicker way to do things, hence why I got into memory. Maybe because I was a bit, lazy in the time, but I'd always do things a bit differently. So when I'm studying, I might, instead of in an essay, I might write a poem in there. And ended up once writing a Metallica song in one of my essays and got a really high mark.
Oh, you got a high mark? I was going to say.
I'm glad the teacher didn't pick it up and say, now, best in the class was Tansel's essay because they included such and such. And I'm like, yes, Metallica. So, I was always doing stuff like that. I never got super, super high grades. I did well in a few subjects. I mean, maths was terrible because I had that creative component and really bad teachers, so it sort of makes up for that. But I wasn't the greatest student. I mean, when I finished the final year of school, I was expecting a really high mark, but it was really low. And I thought, wow, what am I going to do with this? So I got into, the lowest sort of course I can get into at university. And then from there, I got into what I wanted, which was IT. So that was, fortunate enough. But I still kept sort of failing and making it in that sense. But I didn't know any memory techniques. And I just, wrote learning like anyone else. And once I finished university, that's how I got into it. So... so I didn't have to be an amazing studier. I just had to know strategy. So that's how I see myself now, is a more of a strategist. So, people come to me, they know the techniques, they know how to memorize stuff, but they go, well, how do I use it? How do I not get mixed up with all these things? Like I deal with a lot of medical students and lawyers, and they say, yeah, I've got a ton of information here. I know the major system, I know the memory palace, but how do I not confuse? And, do I need thousands of locations? So a lot of these questions are very, very important to know. So what I do is I set a strategy so people can actually use less of their brain and only leave memorization up to that final point, because that's important. If you know the techniques, doesn't mean that you should go ahead and remember everything, right? Because that just means you're using a lot of energy as well. So that's what is important for me, is how can we do things better without sort of exhausting ourselves as well.
Well, also because I find that even though you have a first impression of one, you say one rhymes with bun on the peg memory system. I've always, one gun, I've always said one bun. What I always understood was the first thing that comes to you that is clear, an image that can interact with something else, is a really good one to go to. Don't pick something you think it should be, because you're creating a distance between what should come naturally to you, immediately to you, and what you're trying to remember. And then you're attaching something you're trying to remember to something you're already trying to remember. So that idea of picking something immediately that you go, yep, that'll do. And I know once you do that, you can change it, but I've always thought you're better off if you don't go changing it down the track, because then you can start to confuse yourself. So I teach people, just in terms of my online memorization course for actors, I just do on the hand, I just say, the first rule is make time. And it's like tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. That's the first rule. Second rule is remove all distractions, like you're flicking away all distractions. My third rule is don't take notes. Don't take notes. The next one is like or two rings on the fingers, like a married couple. Watch each video twice before you even try and remember anything, because I'm doing most of the work for the person. And the last one is like a tea party. Have fun, have lots of fun, make silly images, right? So once I teach them that, then I ladder on, I'll teach them other things that are on this hand. And by the third one, they go, hang on, how do I not get that one mixed up with the 5 types of salmon? The chum salmon and the pink salmon and the king salmon and I say, look, well, one way you can do it is this hand, you put a fish in the hand and each image that comes off that has got fish guts dripping out of it or something, so you're connecting those to that. But there's probably a much better way. How would you suggest if let's say someone's got to remember 20 lists of just 5 things like that, they've got to remember 20. How would you structure that in the first place so that they don't get confused at all by the way I'm doing it?
Yeah. Look, there's a number of ways. I mean, when I try and memorize something, before I even do it, I always ask myself, well, what do I need to remember? Or what do I need to do in this case? Yes, baby. Sorry, my daughter's just coming.
That's right.
The chair's broken. That's okay. We'll fix it. Yeah, sit on another chair. That's okay. All right, go. I'm on a video call. Okay. All right, cool. She broke the chair.
Oh.
All right, cool. So how do we memorize it? Well, what I do is, okay, so if it's types of salmon, remember, for me, salmon is the location or the memory palace itself. So I try and visualize a salmon, right? And when I try and visualize something, I try and make it really big, right? So it's big in my mind. If I try and visualize something small, it's hard to pick out. So visualize the salmon. So that becomes my subject. So this is how I memorize a phone book, by the way. I had to remember a business name and a telephone number. So the business name became the subject I was memorizing. So if it was Bob's Plumbing, I'd picture a guy bobbing up and down continuously, non-stop, right? And he's plumbing away and he's got the plumber's crack, everything, all in one vision. So I do the same with the salmon. So I try to make this really big salmon and it's pink and it's huge and, so I'd have this image. Then the types of salmon. So do you have the types of salmon there?
Yes, so there's no, I haven't done it for ages. I remember this is thumb is chum salmon.
Yeah.
This one is, oh god, now I'm on the spot. I haven't done it for a while. This is king salmon because he's tall and kingly. This is silver salmon because it's like a silver ring. Pink salmon because it's the pinky. And anyway, there you go. There's 4 of the 5 salmons.
Okay, cool. So let's start, because what we can do is we can build the story onto that salmon rather than using a memory palace, because memory palace is great. We can use it, but we can also use just direct connection rather than the memory palace. And when I memorized the phone book, I didn't use any memory palace. Right? A lot of people were freaking out saying, how'd you memorize thousands of numbers without a memory palace? Well, the thing is, I didn't need to. It was in my strategy. Well,
but you used the major system for the page numbers?
No. I didn't have to memorize page numbers. So it was only telephone numbers and the business name.
Oh, wow. So when that guy, there was one video and the guy on the show opens, Dave, whatever it is, opens it up and he goes page 2288. You didn't know until he said the business name.
Exactly.
Oh, that's great. Here I am going, wow, how did he memorized all of the page numbers as well?
Yeah, but if I did try and memorize, obviously I'd use a major system to remember the numbers, So getting back to the salmon, so what I do is I picture that salmon normally, then I picture it, if pink salmon was the next one, I'd picture someone painting a pink, right? Maybe it was my daughter because she loves pink and painting in a nice, beautiful, pretty salmon. So that's the pink one. And then, my son comes along. I've got a 9-year-old son. He puts a crown on top saying he's a king salmon. Right? Then what were the other ones?
Chum.
Chum. So, I'm going to pick my wife because she likes feeding cats, but I'm going to say she's feeding a dog, right? And she's got dog food and she's feeding Chum, particular dog food here in Australia, to the salmon. Say, here, have some chum, So she's feeding him salmon, chum. The salmon's loving the chum, So
silver.
chumpy you can carve it. I don't know if you remember that commercial.
Oh, yeah. And then silver.
Silver, okay. So the fish eats this chum, automatically becomes silver, right? Fish becomes silver. And it's glowing. It's, people are like, wow, look at this silver salmon. Right? Remember, this doesn't have to make sense. It's all about the figures, and the stupider it is, the easier it is to remember.
I just remember the other one, which is sockeye, because I sock them in the eye with my finger. Sockeye salmon. So then you go from silver to sockeye. Yeah,
so it's silver, and then someone comes along and pokes it in the eye and say, okay, is this alive? Because it's all silver, right? They might think, hang on, it's not moving. It's like a statue. And pokes it in the eye, and salmon goes, So you can do that. You can play around.
So you
and
just do that. So if there were like 100, I don't know how many there are, but if there were 100 types of salmon, your location becomes the salmon itself, and then you just add all of them. So how do you end up remembering that there are 100 or 72, or how do you tick them off your list when you have to name them?
Yeah, well, here's the thing. If you've got 100 things, then it makes sense not to use that story method that I've given.
Yeah.
Because what happens is that if you make a weak connection in between, you'll forget. The whole thing falls apart.
Yeah.
So this is great for remembering, say, 10 things, maybe.
Exactly.
20 max. Yeah. But if you've got 100, then definitely location.
Yeah.
And what you do is you create another location, another memory palace. So that when I enter memory competitions, we memorize lots of things, and we have to have lots of memory locations, right? So something like 100 salmon, you'd create your own location somewhere different that you're not going to use, right? For something else for a while, and then memorize this salmon in there. So that's what you'd do.
So you have like you could have a big mansion which is shaped like a massive salmon, and it's swimming through the ocean, and it's like a big submarine, but it has 100 compartments in it or something.
Yeah, look, you can. You don't have to make it into a salmon. I mean, you can just pick your house. You can pick, where you work. Mm-hmm. You can pick, just walking down the street. I mean, I've got about 300 locations just walking down the street where I used to live. And, I'd go into cafes and petrol stations and, McDonald's and all those type of things. And, and that wasn't, me just walking around and taking notes. I was just doing it off the top of my head. What does this look like? I'm sure it doesn't look like that in reality. But I've just written down in a spreadsheet, and I just follow the spreadsheet and attach what I need to on there, and it works. And if I want to use that same location, I don't use it for another, say, week or so, just because whatever I memorize on there will be really strong. And if I get back to it soon enough, then you'll get mixed up with the new content.
Right. So part of your preparation, you've got that spreadsheet which those locations don't change, that's set, and you've got gaps where you then go, here's 100 types of salmon, and then you type them in, print it out, and then sit there with it and learn it, or do you don't need to write it down at all? You just read it and attach it to the location.
I don't read. I don't write it down. I just look at whatever, if I'm on a screen or if it's already in a book or something. I just attach it and make the stories, and that's it. It really depends on how you like doing things. I've got a lot of clients that actually like writing the stories down in their spreadsheet. Like, when I teach languages, right, on how to memorize phrases. So you got your English, you've got your, say, Chinese or Japanese or whatever language you're learning, and then you've got the story, right? So, for example, if you're doing Chinese, ni hao ma means, hi, how are you type of thing. Or, there's ni, it's like picturing a ni, how as in how or ow, and ma as in mother. Right, so you can picture banging your knee and going, ow, and then your mother, turns around and says, how are you, instead of saying, what happened? And you go, why did she say, how are you, when, something happened? So something silly, but, people like typing these stories in. And then what they do, instead of just going through and reviewing the English and, the Chinese version, they'll go, I'll just read that story up and down. So it's a good collection of that. Whereas what I do is I like to keep it creative. So if my story's not strong enough, I'll just create a new one as I move along. So I like to play around a bit more. But it's just, horses really.
So here's a question about names. So by using exactly the same, linking one image to another, turning an unfamiliar word into a familiar image, doing the same with another one, and then making them interact. It's obviously really important that they physically touch, they interact, they're absurd, they're cartoon, they're silly, they're sexual, they're violent. I always say to actors, you're inserting something, and they're always like, like they always remember that one on the list of 5. But when it comes to names, the one question I definitely wanted to ask you was, so you go to do these keynote presentations, and obviously you don't have time to prove to everyone you can remember everyone's names, but you go along the front row and 15 or 20 people stand up and you memorize their names and everyone goes, wow, what a genius. So you do that, fantastic, you've got 20 names. How long do you remember those names for if you don't know that you're ever going to see them ever again?
Yeah, look, I guess it depends how long you want to.
Yeah.
There's a thing called spaced repetition where you review something, say 2 hours later. So you'd go through those names again and those visual of those people a couple of hours later, if you want to retain it for a bit longer, and then a day later, 24 hours later, and then maybe 3 days later or 4 days or even a week and then 2 weeks. And so if you want to retain something for long term, you have to review that story, not repetition, but review that story. So that's what you do for longer term. But, if I just met someone and made a story and then never saw them again, there's high likely chance of forgetting. Now, it's really impressive, people remembering someone first time and seeing, like, I've heard a lot of stories with, top executives and, Richard Branson and these type of people. Bill Clinton, yeah. I mean, it's not easy. It's definitely not easy, but you got to keep, reviewing. You got to keep, making the story as incredible as you can. If you make a fairly average story, then you're going to forget, even with a connection.
But also something I think is a bit overlooked is Bill Clinton, people were always like, wow, he could remember people even 20 years later. Well, he's having an event. He's going to say, print out the list of attendees. He's going to scan over them. And, it's overlooked, I think, that when we have social media these days and we go, I can't remember names. If it's because most of our friends now have made up names, I totally get that. But if your friend's name on social media is your friend's actual name, I find it weird that with the repetition of the person's name in social media constantly, I always find it surprising that people don't just remember the names anyway. Because when I'm going to do a class and I get an RSVP list, the first thing I will do is I will take the name and I will search for it on Google under IMDb, or I'll search for it on Facebook to see if it's someone I've met or someone I know, or if they're friends of friends, and then I might see a face. So already I'm giving myself more of an opportunity when I meet them to recall their names. It's not cheating, it's just I want to respectfully remember people's names. So I think it's... I think people are... I love one comment you made. I don't know if it was supposed to be recorded in an interview at the end where you said smartphones dumb people or smartphones stupid people. But people have, the whole use it or lose it kind of thing. I wrote an article about for Backstage at one point saying just because you don't use your George Foreman grill doesn't mean you've lost it. It's in the basement somewhere. You're just not using it, right? Yeah. So when you pull it out and dust it off and plug it in and clean it up, you can use it again, but it's always there. It's not like your brain just hibernates. It's being used for something else. Do you find that, especially when you start to work with people at keynote presentations or whatever, do you spend much time recapping some of those people that you met just in case, or in case they call you randomly one day, or when they call you randomly one day, do you go, okay, who's that, and then you start recapping?
Yeah, not really. I try to make the best associations I can, but you do hundreds of people every year. So it's not, if I did a few, then I'd, try my best. I try my best anyway, but yeah, it's not that easy, to be honest. And you forget. We're humans at the end of the day. So, it's definitely not easy. But, once you make that story up, you've always got that option towards the end. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Because screen's just gone.
I cut out for a second. I came back. Well, that's good to know, because I think for a lot of people, they think, well, God, I'm supposed to, once I say it once, I'll know it forever. And names like Gitanjali, like I said, Great Angel, or Nairi rhymes with diary, some of them do just stick, and other ones you need to recap. As you said, I'd always read an hour later, a day later, a week later, a month later, 6 months later. Yeah. And because I teach this stuff all the time, like, that Salmon list I haven't done for a while, but most of the other stuff that I teach on a regular basis, I now have the confidence that when I go to say it, I know I'm going to know it. Whereas if I went tomorrow to do the Salmon list again, I'd want to recap that before I go in. So I'd say, like, if anyone's watching this and they want to remember names, I'd say it does require a little bit of work, but all of this stuff just makes it easier because it gives you a trigger, and it gives you, as I love watching you do the video with the girl you were writing the numbers and the shopping list with the milk and the bread and the cheese and the eggs and stuff. And you said, and I say this a lot to people, are you 100% or are you 99%? And you said, she's 100%. And I say to people, would you put $1 million of your money on that being 100%? And they say, absolutely. And I say, before as an actor, you'd go, yeah, I'm pretty sure I know my lines. pretty sure is not enough, because that's a weak link potentially, that when the pressure comes and pulls on the chain, the crew is there, you're on set, everyone's looking at you, we're losing light, we've got 5 minutes left. You cannot break under that pressure.
So, I mean, isn't that such a great benefit to have with memory techniques is, you're absolutely 100% sure. I mean, I gave a talk to 500 uni students last night, and I went through these tests. I'm like, are you 100% sure? Like, imagine being 100% sure in your exams.
I know.
And I've taught these skills to students and my colleagues when I did master's degrees, and they got 100% in their exams. I mean, I've never seen people get 100% before. Yeah, they've gotten high 90s, which is great, but, they're absolutely sure of the answer, and that's great. But not only absolutely sure, they're going to retain it for a longer period of time. I mean, it's such a great benefit, and that's why I work a lot in the learning space, because we go to school, we try to learn, but we forget straight away. We do degrees, we forget straight away. We're not of any use to people. We might know a few things, but gee, what did we remember from what we studied for years and years and years? Put all that hard work in. So
and when
that retention is such a benefit from memory.
And when you think about that, anyone who got less than 100%, 70%, 80%, 54%, not only are they not retaining that information, they didn't even just innately know the answers to that. So that's a harsh indictment on the education system, that you and I know that anybody can do this. It requires getting the skill in the first place, taking the time to prepare it in advance, get the structure right, as I say, make sure all the shortcuts and folders are in the right place on your desktop, because it's all in the hard drive. If you've experienced it, I honestly believe it's back there somewhere. We just lost the shortcut. Because when someone says, do you remember that guy that we went to? Then you go, no. And they say, John. And you go, oh, John. Well, you did know. It was there. You just lost the shortcut. They provided
It's funny, people come to me and they say, oh, do you remember me? That's a joke. I'll say, no, are you important?
I only remember people.
Kidding.
I only remember people who stand
I start off my speeches actually, because I always get introduced, and I'll make sure someone introduces me, and I'll make sure I always get their name. So they do the little intro thing, and then I say, oh, thank you, Sandra or George or whatever, but I give the wrong name, and then people go, hang on, this memory guy. And because I've done acting before, right, it looks real. So, but I have to make sure that, I try not to act it too well, because then people will think, okay, this guy's actually forgotten. So, I might have to attend some of your courses there.
That's great. Well, I'll teach you how to not act too well, if that's what you need. So, I've got a couple of things here I just wrote down. I wanted to memorize them, but I didn't have time. One of the things about learning, and it's interesting that you've got you've actually got a book called How to Learn Things in 48 Hours. Learn anything.
Yeah, look, initially I wanted to call it something like Brain Hacks, but the publishing company said they haven't heard of the word hacks before. And I thought, okay, how do I convince them of this? So they scrapped that, and any book with a brain title in it is, brownie points. They wouldn't want that as well. So I'm not, bagging the company. I just thought, different direction. Obviously, they want to go to. So they just said, let's do the book, how to learn. And I'm all right, how to learn anything in 48 hours. And they said, no, it doesn't cover everything, literally. So they wanted to put the word almost in there. I'm like, come on, this is the total opposite of Yellow Elephant. But I can understand what they were thinking literally. Yeah. So it's called How to Learn Almost Anything in 48 Hours. So I don't expect anyone to remember that. But the whole premise of the book is using these principles, you can learn very quickly. And it's not about memorizing, because a lot of people read it and they go, well, it's just about memorizing stuff, not really learning. But if you think about it deep down, once you know it, then you could start absorbing it, and you could start questioning it and reflecting it. And learning doesn't happen just one-off. It could take time. It could take mistakes. I mean, people learn through mistakes as well.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things to consider when learning.
Well, it's interesting because, like the memorization, you can take words that are totally unfamiliar to you, and as we know, turn them into something that's a familiar object or image, and you can remember it. But I always thought, like even way back before I started doing this stuff, that I never started and go to like a private school and study logic and Latin and all that stuff. But I do know that knowing some Latin makes it a hell of a lot easier to remember stuff, because you can break down hyperthymesia, and if you know what easier means and you know what hyper means, you can start to understand that stuff and therefore remember it more. But do you think that that kind of thing, like understanding prefixes and suffixes and so on as parts of languages, do you think that's important, or really just turn it into something familiar and that'll do?
Yeah, look, I remember reading one of Tony Buzan's books, and he's got all the prefixes and suffixes and a whole list of things, and
It
I thought it
wouldn't be
was
that
really
one by
cool.
any chance, would it?
Yeah, probably that one, yeah. Because that's a book that I picked up because a friend of mine got me into memory. And I said, oh, which book do I need? This is amazing stuff. And he couldn't remember the name of the book. I was like, yeah. So he said it's by Tony Buzan. So anyway, I picked up Master Your Memory. What he meant was use your memory, right? So Master Your Memory is more lists and stuff. So I didn't really get it. But I did see the prefixes and stuff. I'm like, this is cool. Once you know what's at the end and what's at the start, I mean, you can just basically, understand what it's all about. So I think it's really good to know that stuff. I mean, it depends on the individual, really. I might enjoy that stuff, and some people might say, "Oh, stuff it, I'll just do this."
Yeah.
It really depends on what the individual wants. But look, I like learning about that stuff because there's not many suffix and prefixes, and then you can just put them in, locations and palaces and make silly stories, and off you go. You've got it.
Well, that's why I felt like that Tony Buzan book, and I mean, he was sort of the master of marketing memory. I mean, he had the personality. He put together. I mean, and this Master Your Memory book is very comprehensive, like English, Spanish, capitals, countries, anatomy. I mean, he's like, you know what? Someone is always going to do better than me, so I'm just going to put everything in there before. He's got like Chopin, Liszt, Wagner, Verdi, musicians, philosophers, artists, and it's only that thick, the book. I mean, but I did really like in your book the way it stood out that you talked about, in particular, speed reading, which is, I was saying to someone last night, if you are a writer and you want to be as prolific as Shakespeare or L. Ron Hubbard punching out his sci-fi novels, and you want to be a prolific writer, Stephen King, and you can't touch type, well, you're limiting yourself, obviously. And you want to be a reader and you want to get through all of Harry Potter's books, but you can only read as fast as you can speak, you're severely limiting yourself. You don't have enough time. So would you mind just quickly running through the basic ideas of speed reading, what to do and why you think it's important?
Yeah, look, I mean, I remember reading Harry Potter in 10 minutes, the book.
In 10 minutes?
Yeah, look, the comprehension wasn't that great, but I just wanted to test myself. Harry, Harry Wand, Harry Train,
it's
Harry,
all
about the speed.
Hermione.
So,
your daughter must have loved that night.
I was very young when I read it, like 25 or something. That's young for me.
Wow.
So, yeah, I mean, speed reading is essentially memory. That's how I see it, because what you're doing is you're encoding stuff that doesn't make sense, right, into something that makes sense, which is visual. So when we're trying to remember something, right, let's say, we get the word, well, what am I say, enough, right? It's kind of abstract, right? We don't get an image straight away. So what do we have to do? Well, enough might be you've got a bag full of stuff, right? So for me, that took maybe a couple of seconds or even less if I go into competition, but I've created an image. So that's what, memorizing is, really. It's encoding something you don't know into something you do know visually, and then, making that story up, all that sort of stuff. So what speed reading is you're not really memorizing. All you're doing is you're encoding a bunch of words together into an image. So I'll give you an example. If you're reading something, and I'll just give a very basic example, the cat jumped over the bridge or something like that. By the time I say bridge, then you've got some sort of an image, right? Now, that's an easy example, but most of the stuff we read is all technical. And, there's jargon, there's a lot of abstract words we haven't come across. So we don't get an image straight at the end of the sentence. We just keep going, right? We keep reading, and then we realize that we've got no image. We'll go back and reread.
Yeah.
Right?
And then do the same thing again.
That's the only reason why we go back and reread, because the image doesn't come into our head, right? Now, this is sort of, we've gone backwards in time. If you look at, ancient Egypt, hieroglyphics, they were all in images, weren't they? They were all in images. So people would read the stories out. And if you had a wall full of hieroglyphics, you'd read that in no time because you're reading the story. Mm-hmm. But if you had a wall full of words, right, as we do now, it'll take you bloody ages, right? So
that's a great way to put it.
Yeah, so we need to encode those group of words together. And how do you do that? Well, one way is to use your finger, right? If you use your finger, your eyes actually don't do the reading, your brain does. And that was, from Tony Buzan book that I read. So as soon as you start guiding your brain to the content, it's like you're watching the movie unfold of what you're reading. Now, obviously, when you start off doing this, you're not going to have great encoding capacity, right? So the trick to improving your encoding is through memory training. So, this is what I teach my clients is before I teach them speed reading first, I actually show them to encode faster. So get them to memorize numbers, cards, list of words, all that sort of stuff, so they can get to a higher level in terms of their encoding. Once you're at a higher level in encoding, when you read something, even if it's abstract, then you're going to create some sort of an image out of it. And if you read visually, right, even if you're not using your finger, even if you're just reading normally as you would, then what's going to happen is you're going to start to see the content. Another example, let's say you're watching a movie, right? Now, when we're watching dialogue happen, what happens? Do we try and memorize every single word, right, as it happens? No, we just watch it and let it unfold in front of us. Well, when we're reading every single word, right? Every single word. So what that means is that we haven't really improved our reading state from, say, a grade 1 level, right? We were taught to read word by word. We haven't moved on from there. We haven't moved on to reading in groups of words and seeing images from that. And that's why they say speed reading, because once you start reading groups of words, you naturally read faster. You don't go word by word by word. You go into groups and you read a lot faster because now you're seeing images as you read. So that's what speed reading essentially is.
Do you find with using your finger, do you find that reading things on a electronic device makes that easier because you're physically interacting with it, or do you literally need to go across the line and then scroll up and go across the line?
Look, it's pretty difficult on electronic devices because as soon as you touch the screen, something can happen.
Yeah.
The book can go to the next page and, I accidentally flip it the other way. But, I sometimes read on my phone. And what happens is you can set, if you've got iBooks, you can set it in scroll mode. So I just discovered this. And you can scroll up, and just by the virtue of scrolling up, it's like you can sort of chunk by sentence, right? So you can scroll up, and I read many books like that on my device. On something like an iPad or Kindle or something like that, might be a little bit more difficult. I've got a pen, so I just sort of do that. But I've trained my eyes. I've been doing this for 15 years, so I've trained my eyes to see like I'm using my finger as well. But it really depends on what you want to do. Some people just don't want to speed read. You want to kick back in bed, read a novel. You don't have to speed read, right? But if you've got emails and work documents and things like that, and you've got scripts that you really want to get through, and scripts are great because they're highly visual, so you can really speed read. And a lot of people think speed reading is skipping words or skimming and things like that. Well, it's not the case. You actually have to read everything to make sure it's all in context. Because the dog is different to a dog, right? So if you skip out the the and a, well, what's different? The dog, like he's the dog, right? Instead of a dog, well, it's just a dog, right? So see, two different images altogether. So you want to be able to grab that through visualization. So, you've worked with a lot of scripts. When you're sort of going through that, how do you, go through it yourself? Is it visually? Is it reading sort of word by word?
Well, I also write a lot of scripts too. So when I've read a lot of screenwriting books, they all say just pare it right back to the barest minimum that you need to tell the story. The imagination will do the rest. But also, even in terms of a paragraph, separate with a line break different units of action. So even if it says, Tansel nods politely, his daughter enters the room, you wouldn't have that on the same line. You would give it a line break because it's a brand new thing that you want the eye to pay attention to. So even reading a great writer, technically, will write a script that you can, it's just a page turner, even if the subject isn't that interesting, because just the way it's written. Someone can be writing a really fascinating story, but you keep getting bogged down simply because of technically the way it's written. But that sort of leads me to what came up while you were talking was, I remember seeing an article recently about how articles online are changing the way that we're writing in chunks, as you say. Well, what you mean by chunks is the cat jumped over the fence.
Yeah, in images, in context, yeah.
That's right.
That's
So
right.
you're saying get as many as is manageable. So if one image of a cat jumping over a fence gets you there, you don't need to remember all of the words.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
this article was talking about how because of the way devices are and because of people's attention span shrinking, they pulled out one article and they showed you pretty much every paragraph, every sentence was a new paragraph because the margins are much, much smaller, so they're longer,
Yeah.
so people think they're longer paragraphs. But they said this is actually like one sentence per paragraph. And I know when I write for Backstage, sometimes I'm like, I don't think this is a new paragraph, but I know if I keep going on the one paragraph, people are going to think this is too long and they're going to switch off. How do we, not our job, I guess, but it makes me wonder, how do you combat that when you need someone's attention span to grow their attention span?
It's interesting you mention that because I read something in my book as an exercise, and as I wrote the article in there, little exercise for speed reading, I wrote the images, I broke them up into brackets, right? So every few words or whatever created an image were in brackets. And I thought, this is, not just a good exercise, but it's a good exercise in reading just the images. So, you can practice on stuff like that. And you can, even better, you can pick out something that doesn't have brackets. I mean, obviously not everything has brackets. But you can create the brackets as you're reading. Say, okay, here's the image, here's the image, here's the image. So you're creating your version of what you're reading. And hence, because you're interacting with what you're reading, you're understanding a lot more. So that's one little thing that people can do. Yeah.
Well, you would have seen in the book the looping and threading section where I get people to, and when I heard you calling it chunking, I'm like, I just called it looping or chaining or whatever. But the idea that you say, once more into the breach over to be or not to be, that's the question. I always start actors and say, if you had to circle or loop the barest minimum keywords or phrases in that sentence, what would you circle? So it might end up be, not be, question. And then we do a thread, a line from the last word in that line, which is question, to the first one and the next one. So what you say, as you're saying, is because you're physically interacting with it, it means that you're more likely to be recalling it, but also you are saying, this is important to me, this is important to me, this is important to me. And later on, I noticed after doing this for a few years, when actors would do their scene and I'd go, something's missing, I'd look down at their script and they'd skipped a line where they hadn't circled anything in that sentence. That was interesting because their brain went, not important. And so I had physical proof that they had somehow decided that sentence wasn't important, and because it wasn't important, they didn't remember it. And finally, on that whole point, when there's like a non sequitur or a beat change and it doesn't naturally flow, when people have the circled, the looped last key word and the next key phrase, and they physically have to draw a line from there to there, they have to make a connection between those two images. When I've looked down at the script and actors have looped all of the key words and phrases, but they keep forgetting, I look and there's no thread between those two parts. I mean, it's an exact science in terms of going, you are going to forget that because this is what you've done. And even the way that,
what I do is, sorry, I cut you off.
Oh, just sorry to finish. I was going to say, just even in the way that I can tell where actors are going to struggle by the way that it's formatted on the page. So I can tell on a page turn, actors are largely going to forget what comes next because it's literally separated. So I teach them how to take the top lines from the second page, put it at the bottom of the first page, so it's like looking around the corner in a mirror before they turn, and so we wed those pages together. And when there is lots of, there's your dialogue, stage direction, and then your dialogue again, almost every actor is going to try to stumble over that because they expect it to be the other person's dialogue. So I teach them about the traps and hurdles in the script, how to anticipate those, so when they do a cold read, for instance, they just get the script 5 minutes before that they can actually do it. I've loved how just all of the memorization stuff just sort of out of necessity just was solving actors' problems all of the time as I was going.
Yeah, and I was just about to mention is sometimes we generally do forget, right, or skip things, but sometimes we can skip it on purpose, like I'm not going to remember this. That's another technique I picked up from one of my coaches. I had a coach when I was going into the competition, and he said, look, if you can't remember it, just make a mental note saying, I'm going to forget this, right? I'm going to forget it, move along. right? Paying attention to what you're going to forget. Not going to do that many times in the competition because we're generally memorizing. But what happened was that because I said I'm going to forget this, it was a trigger to remember it. So, fascinating little memory technique there as well is if you don't have many things to do, but you've just got one or two things saying, I'm just going to forget that, what's going to happen is you'll most likely remember it if you've made that mental attachment.
Well, that's it. That's one of the things I point out early on, that the things we're most likely to remember, the primacy effect, the first few things, the recency effect, the most recent couple of things, and those things that stand out, and the things that we associate or we link with something else. So I say you go to a party and you're more likely to remember the person who opened the door when you arrived than the third person they introduced you to on the way in the room. You're more likely to remember the drunk guy you stepped over on the way out of the party than the fourth last person standing waiting for the bathroom as you walk down the hall on your way out. You're more likely to remember the naked guy who ran through with a lampshade on his head. And you're more likely to remember the person that you discovered went to the same school as you in Melbourne, and you didn't realise you haven't seen them for 30 years. So when I'm doing memorisation stuff on lines with actors, I say, because those things those are the ways that we innately recall stuff. If we don't, because it's logical, literal, linear, and we don't recall it, we can't use logic, we can't be linear, we can't be literal, because we would have already remembered it. So we have to make it silly, stand out, associate it with something. And as soon as you do, not only is it highly, highly likely that you recall it, but people's faces light up. They have fun doing it. Imagine, my God, I say to people all the time, I could only imagine if I knew this stuff when I was at school. Even if I had no interest in the subject, I would have had interest, a fascination in trying to construct a memory palace and put all of these bits of information I didn't care about into the right rooms. I would have been getting the 100% in the exam.
Yeah, that's why I went back to study, so I can test all this stuff out. I mean, I got into it after I finished university. So, and, I had this thirst of, once you get into a memory, it's like it gives you a boost of confidence to say, well, actually, I can tackle the world now. I can do things that I never thought it possible. So that's what I felt. Just by remembering 6 or 7 items, that's the powerful effect that it has because you're certain.
So tell me, you're
acting.
Exactly. You're sitting in a auditorium at a lecture or a TED talk or something like that. You don't have any notes, you don't have a pen or anything. You sit there and you're seeing images and you're allowing the things to hit you. Are you ever worried that you may miss an important bit, that you should be taking some notes, or are you confident now that any salient, most important part is just going to register and you're just going to recall it?
Yeah, look, that was my biggest weakness because I always thought I had a shocking memory, and I used to say it to everyone. I mean, I used to play in a band, and my bass player would always say, "Why don't you memorize the notes?" And I'd say, "No, shocking memory." He'd say, "Play a G chord." I'm like, "What's that?" I just know it off the top of my head, whatever it is. So, when it came to lectures and talks and stuff, I'd never go to them because 1 year out the other. Horrible. I remember. When I was a young kid, my grandfather used to say, we'd watch the news, and he'd say, well, what happened on news? We just watched it. And I couldn't tell him. I was like, I don't know. He goes, but you just watched it. So he'd be testing me, right? And this I was always like that ever since growing up and, in class and everything. So, talks, what happened? But as soon as I got into memory, I realized that, I love note-taking anyway. So I still do it because I like writing the important points down. But you shouldn't do it enough to detract you from the actual talk. So when I actually, speak to students and stuff, I said, well, you can take down key points, but don't go writing whole sentences and things like that, because your job is to just actively listen and visualize. That's more important, is to visualize, not just to listen, because you can listen but not get anything. Yeah. So what improved memory for me for actual talks and stuff is just to visualize. If they said they were running, just imagine them running a marathon or 100 meters. If they were in a bad time of their life or something like that, really maybe picture yourself as that person, feeling and going through the pain of what they're going through. So that's what I try and do now, is to really involve myself in the talk. And And just by doing that, you're going to retain a lot much more information just by visualizing. And again, same process as memory, same process as speed reading, is to visualize and engage your senses, the movement, the sex, all that sort of stuff. Put that in there. The more you do that, the thing is, it's the most difficult when it's live and it's happening. So if you try to memorize a talk then and there, it's very difficult. If you try to visualize it, you can. But it's something that improves with time.
One of the things that I've found has worked quite well in my classes is we'll do a 3-hour class, we'll do a bunch of different techniques, we'll shoot some stuff, we'll sit down, we'll work on the script, and at the end, along the way I'll recap stuff, but at the end I'll say, so what are the top things that you took from today? Can we come up with 5 things that we can take from today? And everybody looks at their notes. I'm like, don't look at your notes, don't look at your notes. And then they go, okay, and then they just blink into space, and I say, what's going to help you is, where were we all physically in space in the last 3 hours? Remember, I was over there. Remember, I waved my arms at one point. Remember, the 2 of you sat in the corner. Remember, someone sat backwards on a chair. All at the moment I want you to do is I want you to recall the physical configurations that happen. And as soon as they do, and this is like the whole kind of sense memory kind of thing in terms of acting, as soon as they do, all of this other stuff comes flooding back, and these notes come out. So I will always say, so when we began, I was standing over here, and these 2 guys stood there, and there was something about it back and forth. And they go proximity, right? The difference between getting closer and further away and the water rising and falling. Okay, great, okay. And then I said, I walked over there and I shouted and I raised my arms. And, where are stakes? But even if they went to their notes and read stakes and proximity, that doesn't mean it's going in. It doesn't mean they're seeing it, they're just reading off the page. So that's why I'm not a fan of notes at all, unless their notes I write to then sit down and go, now I'm memorizing these myself to teach other people. Otherwise, I'm just like, no. If you don't recall it from imagining where we were in space and how we interacted, the images that were created, then I probably didn't teach you anything anyway.
Yeah, that's so true. And when I used to run my workshops, I used to do the same sort of thing, but involve sometimes at the start of each section or throughout when I'm explaining things, just little stories for the key words of what I was teaching, or the sections. So, and by the end, I said, well, how many things do you remember? They might say 3 or 4 things or whatever. Well, actually, you remembered all 40 points of the workshop. And they go, what? Remember when we walked in and there was this big eye and you're using a visual guide and then this and that, blah, blah, blah. So by the end of it, they actually do remember 40 points. So, like I said, we're in a state now that we've got everything that we need, right? So we've got the skills to show people how to remember 40 things, but, what's the impact of that? What can people take away from that and use that for good? So that's what we need to really work on. Yeah, it's great to remember all these things or phone books and whatnot, but what's a real benefit of doing it? Well, is it showing, creativity? Is it showing that we can now use it to benefit human beings, to get up in space or whatever? So it's the skills derived from this and not so much the showcase of them initially.
And that's it. And ultimately, if people don't have to do something, then unless they're really fascinated by it, in which case I'd say they have to, they're compelled anyway, because for me, this started as such a fun party trick. This was just the only reason I did it. It would be a party trick, and people would go, wow, how did you do that? And then I would teach them, and it would, connect me with other people. It would break the ice, and it would be fun. So to me, I had to do that because it was a way to connect with people. But if you don't have to do it for your work, if you don't have to do it for social reasons, if you don't have to do it for your own protection in life, to be able to live a long, healthy life, then people have fun with it, but then they go straight back to, I'm going to search for that email in my phone or that contact in my list or that phone number. I'm just going to press it. But as soon as you are overseas and you haven't got the new SIM card yet and you've got to go to an actual phone and you've got to call someone and you realize, what the hell is the phone number? At that point you go, that would have been handy just to even memorize that one phone number.
And here's the thing that I've found is that with memory, it's not just about memorization as well. That's what you do with memory, but working with memory specifically 15 years sort of gets you on a road where, okay, now you're able to use memory. Well, you can help people with stress and anxiety and time management and things like this. I mean, I was invited to Iran a few years ago to speak to 1,000 executives on stress management.
Wow.
Right? How to manage stress. And there's things like, visualization. So if you train your memory, you're getting to a stage where your visualization is a lot better.
Yep.
And when we're stressed, we're usually telling ourselves a story,
yep.
right? There's already these huge stories in our head. So how can you change that narrative? How can you change that story to be something better, right? So this is what memory can actually help you with as well.
That's great.
And I've actually just worked on an app called Happy Waves, and I've got lessons on there which people can listen to on how to, change a language, how to, reduce stress, all that type of stuff, just through memory, right? It's bizarre as it seems, because people go, what's stress got to do with memory? Or what's, time out, what's procrastination, what's, performance got to do with memory? But when you look at it, everything's almost in a visual sense. So if you improve your visual capacity, you can be a better sports person, right? Because now you're using your imagination to, make better decisions, or just be better in general, like kick better goals, things like that. And I've worked with sporting teams, and they've achieved such results. So, it's about really digging deeper into memory as such, and that's where I really found the benefit of it. Not so much in remembering, because when people come to me, it's like, I want to remember this and this. And when we dig deeper, it's like, well, at the end of the day, they just want to be happy, or they just want a better job, or, well, how can we get a better job using memory techniques? So I often teach people how to earn a higher income using the memory skills that they've got. So it's bizarre where memory can actually lead you. So,
I definitely know. I love starting, pretty much I start every class with a list of 12 colours: green, blue, red, orange, yellow, purple, black, grey, pink, indigo, gold, and ivory. And I say, look, tell me those colours back. And people get some, they don't. And then I teach them all how to memorise those, with the Incredible Hulk jumping into the blue ocean, splashing red Spider-Man who spits out an orange and hits the yellow brick road. And then everybody does it, and everyone's like, wow. And then I get one person and I say, do it backwards. And they're like, I can never do it backwards. And then they do it backwards. And at that point, everybody goes, wow. Their minds are open. They're filled with possibility. And that for me is something I will always love doing, because it just gives everyone that boost, that if that's possible, and I thought I would never be able to do that, imagine what we can do in the rest of this session. Rather than going, hey, look how impressive I am that I can do this. It's no trick. You do it. It's just a technique. You've learnt it in literally 2 minutes. You can now do that. You can memorize any phone number, any name, any this and that. So, of course, your confidence is going to boost. And if your confidence boosts, that's going to change. I love the fact that you said you're already telling yourself a narrative in your head anyway. You're already telling yourself a story. So why not tell the story that you want to tell? And that's going to absolutely change what happened today. Instead of the Uber driver was a pain in the butt, and someone a cyclist almost hit me as I got out of the car. And, well, you're telling yourself this story anyway, and it's very very clear.
Here's the thing, right? The future hasn't happened. So why do we keep telling ourselves negative stories of the future when it hasn't happened? You could do the opposite and tell positive stories of the future. Right? See how that works out. Right? If you built up your memory technique, built up your visualization skills, you trained it, you can actually create an amazing, future. Right? Doesn't mean it's going to happen, but it's going to make you feel better. Right? And if you're feeling better, you're going to, this law of attraction stuff, right? Whether you believe it or not, you're going to feel better. You're going to talk differently. You're going to walk straighter. Stand up. All that sort of stuff is a huge benefit for you. So, instead of saying, oh no, I've got these bills to pay, I'm going to be broke, blah, 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 we'll say, well, what would you like to see happen? So that's often a question I always ask people, well, what would you like to see happen? And they
Scarlett Johansson to turn up in a Ferrari. And
they still give me negative responses, like, I don't want to be stressed, and, things like that. Well, you're still using a negative word, because the brain doesn't know no. It doesn't like, if you say no stress, it's going to see the word stress, right? So I'll say, well, what's the opposite of stress for you? And a lot of people struggle because their language is just so negative. So it's often a transformation using, such memory techniques to help people get on the right path of, being positive and taking control of their life. And you can tell they were struggling for so long because of this language. So once you change and say, okay, maybe opposite of stress for me is calm. okay, now visualize calm. What does it look like? And suddenly their shoulders drop and they're relaxed and they're on a beach and whatever. And I was like, well, there you go. So even if you just think of opposite words that are positive and visualize that, fantastic. Yeah.
Especially handy for all of the students that you'd be teaching and before exams and stuff like that, because it's one thing to have these skills and to at home know all of the information, but then when you get there and you start to freak out, you tell yourself that negative narrative, then of course doesn't matter, all this work is not going to help you.
Everyone, even relationships, husband wants to go back to his wife home and they just had a fight and it's like, I don't want to go, I don't want to fight again. Well, instead of saying that and say, well, I'm going to go back and I can just visualize, everything being happy and, we're all talking nicely. Doesn't mean it's going to happen. You just want to be in that state of mind. Remember that, you're not trying to create a sense of false hope. What you're trying to do is create a narrative in your head that's positive, because that's going to make you feel a lot better. And if you're feeling better, then, you start attracting and working towards more positive things. So that's the real essence of this visual stuff.
That's right. And if you had a choice between attracting negative and attracting positive, not many people would choose the negative, and it's not like the negative is solving any problems by talking about it all the time. So I say to people, and myself, like, you're talking about it, right? So clearly it's bothering you. Is there something you can do about it? Yes. Great. Then do that. Is there something you can do about it? No. Then there's no point talking about it. And
there's another really good way of dealing with it as well is, my wife's a psychologist, so that kind of helps. And she said, look, is it useful to think about it? If it's not useful, chuck it away. And it was also in another documentary I saw recently on the minimalists. I don't know if you've seen those guys, pretty awesome. No. Check out, theminimalist.com. And so these guys in the documentary, one of the guys, that they're interviewing said, well, he's had a lot of problems and, said, look, is this useful to think about it? And he said, no. So I just sort of left it. But you got to acknowledge it and say, well, it's not useful. I acknowledge it instead of, just disregarding it. And then sort of move along. So it's a great little tool to have, if you're stressing out, if you're sort of down and out, say, is it useful? Not really.
But it's great because a negative thing may be useful. So that's fantastic. And you're already turning that into a positive reason for having this negative feeling in the first place, rather than pretending it doesn't exist. Oh, there's nothing I can do and burying it. That's great.
It's definitely not easy. It's definitely not easy, but this is where memory comes in. If you've improved your visual capacity, if you've improved the memory training side, then it's easier to make stories. And if it's easier to make stories, then it's easier to change this narrative. If you haven't done that, then what happens is that even if you want to go positive, you'll still move to the negative, because that's your whole life's just been in that direction and you don't know how to change it. You haven't got the right strategies. Even if you say something positive, it's not going to work, right? So just by training memory will help you change that narrative. So it's extremely powerful.
I love that, and I know we'll wrap up shortly because you've been very generous with your time, but I love that, the word strategy there as well, because whether you think of it as a mechanical kind of strategy or a mathematical strategy or an organic strategy, it's still a strategy. You think, oh, we've got kids and we want to go on a holiday. Well, you start thinking, okay, how can we do that? When are the holidays going to be? You don't have to overthink it, but you need some kind of strategy. You can run out the door with the kids and then just sit on the side of the street for 2 days, which is not going to be that much fun. But any kind of a strategy always is bound to help you. I just wanted to ask you I had a million questions I would love to ask you, but thank you so much for your time. But the one thing that I've always found difficult, and I don't have a strategy for it. I've never read one or heard of one, or if there was one, I must have sped right past that bit. So I can use the systems that I have to memorize dates, names, calendar appointments, whatever. How do you remind yourself that you even have an appointment? Because I can remember when it is, but how do you then remember? So I say at 4 o'clock today, I've got something. 5 o'clock today, I'm talking to you on Skype, right? So that's great, and I set it in my calendar, and it reminds me, and the phone reminds me. It's all good. It's a system that works for me, but it relies on electronics. If I didn't have that, is there a way that you can somehow program your body clock to remind you half an hour before 5 o'clock that I'm supposed to be talking to you on Skype?
Yeah, it's a good question because it's something that happens quite a lot, and I use Google Calendar quite a bit, so that sort of helps. But I don't have many things on there because I try and keep things to a minimum. But it almost comes back to a very similar technique that you had for getting your students to remember content, right? So it's like, well, where are you planning to be around that time, right? So if you think about that, say plan to be 4:30, where can I visualize myself? There's a meeting going on, right? Where am I planning to be? Not, because you could be somewhere else totally, or, you could be other side of town.
Yeah.
But, where am I planning to be this afternoon? So even just a trigger, remember, it doesn't have to be a super duper, memory technique. It could just be a trigger getting you there.
Well,
right?
You could do the journey method, even just in 3 steps from Santa Monica to Hollywood to North Hollywood, if that's where I have to be at 6 o'clock tonight. I could even have that thing of where am I going to...
Or you can use the major system if you really wanted to. I try not to get into too much of that. So let's say 4 o'clock. 4 is an R, right? The letter R. So you could say, you're eating raw beef with this person you're about to meet today. Yeah. Right, but what you do is, you made that story, but you have to attach it to something.
I know.
You have to attach it to something. So if it's half an hour before, right, you got to attach it to the half an hour before. So if it's 3:30 that you need to be reminded, right, that 3:30 has to have an image now.
Yep.
Right, it has to have an image. So what is 3:30 image? Now, again, you could have use your major system. So that's MMS. Right, so MMS message. I don't know if people use it, or I don't even know if I've ever used it. But you're using your phone to send an MMS message. So that's the story. Now, how are you going to get that story? What's going to trigger that story? Right?
I know. I still need to be looking at the clock, and then
you
go.
You need to be looking at the clock. What if you don't look at a clock?
Yeah.
Right. So you got to find the trigger that is going to trigger that. That's going to trigger that.
Yeah. Well, you got me thinking. I really like it. Like we've just come to the end of the summer holidays here, so it's been very quiet for months. There's a middle school across the road and a primary school over here. But now, at a certain time of day, you always hear 3 o'clock, you hear the noise, the parents are coming, the kids are picking someone up. So even without realizing it, we already have that kind of memory system innately in our bodies because we go, oh, I can hear the postie's bike. Oh, it must be that time. Yeah. Oh, I can hear the kids coming. Oh, I can hear. So it's really what you're saying is about taking what we're already doing, but finding those other locations I'm going to be doing the thing that I'm going to be doing, having a meeting with you on Skype and picking the computer up and, shaking it so I can get your image to fall through to making it rather than just me sitting in front of it.
It could be that, sometimes that image that you have that's consistent, like picking up the kids or something, that could change. If it's a weather timetable or the kids are let out early, what then? And you've set your appointment for 4 o'clock, but suddenly kids have left 2:45. But it's still going to trigger because that trigger might be from kids leaving school. Oh, yeah, I remember. Yeah. I've got a meeting straight after.
That's right.
But if you've got a lot of meetings, you're going to have a lot of triggers as well. So it really depends on how difficult you make it for yourself and how easy at the same time.
But that's already you've blown my mind. Like that's why I was really excited to talk to you because I've been doing memorization for 20 years. I've taught thousands of people this stuff as well, but nothing like what you're doing because it's largely for actors and it gets to a point where they don't need to know much more than that. So myself, I feel like the flea that's been jumping up against the cling film on the glass and the things come off and he's still jumping at the same height, right? So talking to you about stuff like that, like the major system, as I said, I'd never mastered even though I read it for the first time 20 years ago.
Yeah.
I want to do that. I will do that. And even that appointment thing, I really want to try that because, as you said, it's exactly what I've been doing with getting people to remember where we were physically in space in the past. Yeah. So it's now visualizing that in the future. Yeah. I know you've got to go, but I have one final question.
Yes.
And it really was about how long did it take you to read my book, for instance?
Look, I didn't read it fully. I just went through bits and pieces. So yeah.
So when you,
from what I saw, I thought, wow, this is it's blown me away because just the amount of content, but the way it was done, it was like, because that's how I wrote my first book, the 4 most powerful memory techniques, and I used PowerPoint. And made images in there, instead of just all text, and it made it memorable. So as soon as I looked at your book, I'm like, wow, he's made it memorable. So it's not just a book on memory; he's made the book memorable for people, and I just thought it was outstanding.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, because I had read all these memory books, and they were all just words, and I wanted to get your opinion because I thought, in horror films they say, don't show the monster, hint at the slime on the ground or the claw marks or the whatever, because as soon as you see it, it's finite. But when you imply it, our imagination makes it even worse than it is. We just hear someone screaming and we think that's terrible, but as soon as you see a rubber monster, you just go, oh, that's awful. So I didn't know with the book, because so many memorization books were just text, I wanted to make it visual, but I was a little concerned that by having very clear image like the fleas on a bull, and the origin of counterfactual thinking sentence, that might limit people because it's finite. Whereas if I said fleas on a bull, everybody has their own imagination of what fleas on a bull should look like. Do you think it doesn't matter? Do you think people do the workaround in their brain regardless?
It depends. There's some people aren't really visual at all, so they'll read it. And this is why I struggle with reading, because I'd read something like that. It could be highly descriptive, and then I'm like, So I need to really work on my visualization skills. That's why memories help me to read better. So having a visual there, having the word there. I mean, they all work together. I mean, you would have seen Death by PowerPoint. People get up and just write a whole bunch of words and, expect people to understand it. Well, as soon as you cut a few words, keep them more generic and maybe have an image there, now they all sort of connect. So, the more we can get into images, video, like we're doing now, the more powerful I think it is. But, having said that, if you also have specific content, like my wife's also an author and she's written an amazing book, and it's just got one sentence per page, and it's just so powerful. It literally makes people cry when they read it until the end. So things like that, images won't do it justice because it's just so powerful. The words reading that, so it really depends on the context and the content that you've got.
It's also fascinating when people get up and do even good TED Talks. They'll be talking, they'll put up an image, and they'll have text on the image, and what they're saying, what we're seeing, and what's written are three different things, and the brain is competing to try and understand what the point is, but it doesn't even realize it's doing it. So it gets this cognitive dissonance, or it shuts down. I find myself doing it, going, you're talking and you're interesting. That image is interesting, and that sentence is interesting. But stop two of them and just let us see the other one. Let us get the image of the car crash for a couple of seconds, then have the text come up, then tell us. But don't tell us three conflicting things at the same time. And if you're telling us the same thing 3 times, then we've got it anyway. You don't need it. So I love the fact that you're helping people find ways to do that. And even
memory skills definitely help with communication. I remember doing this project that went for a whole year, and it was about 30, 40 people that did it. And, everyone had to do their presentation, 7-minute presentations. There's about 25 people in the day that did it from 9 o'clock till, 5 o'clock at night, non-stop. So what happened was that everyone had these elaborate PowerPoint presentations, a year's worth of work, and, all these slides back to front. And, I mean, I couldn't remember any of them. So I didn't prepare anything, by the way, because I worked the whole year for this project. So I already had everything in my mind. I mean, if I can't talk about what I did for a whole year, that's pretty disastrous. So that's what I initially thought. So I found a flip chart at the end of the room, so I brought that in, and I drew just the one triangle in the middle. I found a green texter. I drew one triangle, and I said, 3 things that I'm going to talk about, in my project. And one was, this is what I was doing. 3 things that I needed to do was, develop a strategy, work on techniques and the application. And that's it. And I talked about those 3 things. And by the end of it, everyone remembered my talk. And they were blown away because, they got it. And it was just one simple thing. And they didn't have to focus on all these words. And they didn't have distractions in their mind. And the way that I turned the whiteboard was in towards them. So they only saw a closed space and not this massive open space. So, these little tricks, the memory techniques help with communicating effectively as well. And that's what I found that's helped me a lot is, how can I get the best out of, what I'm teaching, what I'm sharing and, sending a message rather than let's just get all this information out and hope for the best. Well, yeah.
No, that's great. That's something that it's taken me a long time to learn because I kept thinking, I'm not going to have these people forever. I have to give them all of the information that I know. And then they would just drown in all of this information. I said, it's great, but what do I do with it? So then I got, I hope, better at saying, let's pick, when you walk away and you choose out of everything we've done, which are the 5 things that you can take away, and we attach them to those fingers on the hand. So worst case scenario, they take their hand out, they remember those 5 things, and at least they've taken something away. But anyway, I could talk to you forever, Tansel. Thank you very much for your time. You've got another client in 15 minutes, so I hope you get a bit of a breather before then to look after your sick daughter.
She'll keep me busy anyway. But thanks for your time as well, and hope this video comes out okay, because there's a lot of people that don't know about this stuff. And I think, getting this information out to people, to as many people as you can, and sharing it is highly valuable with, all the stuff that you're doing, stuff that I've been working with. And then there's similar people out there as well that don't know how to get this message across and stuff like that. So as long as we're, helping each other out, I think we can really share this message. So thank you very much for, making it happen.
Oh, man, it's just so great that the only reason we got in touch was because I signed up for your free memorization emails, and I was like, I don't think I've had mine come through yet, and we started chatting. So I'm glad I didn't receive it immediately. Otherwise, I never would have met you. For anybody who is watching, this is an awesome book, and your second book is called How to Learn
Almost Anything in 48 Hours.
Almost anything in 48 hours. In 72 hours, you can remember everything, but in 48, almost everything. All right, man. That is awesome. Thank you so much. And once again, thank you for your time.
We'll keep in touch.
Absolutely. I'd love to.
Awesome. Thanks.
All right. Okay. Bye. Cheers, mate.